There you go. You want a bonkers James Joyce related story? It's hilarious. And it just so happens that this guy looks like the spitting image of Oscar Wilde. So it's...
No. Oh my gosh. You have hit the jackpot. First time you heard about Joyce. Why are you in like the Sweeney's reading club? Like, that's crazy.
I grew up in Ireland, right? So Joyce is part of our world. And in Ireland growing up, literature and music and art are very much a part of everything. It permeates everything in a strange way. There's a in a wonderful way, but for the most part, I mean, people will, you'll be talking to someone, the bus driver might quote Yeats to you, it's always part of conversation. But Joyce, interestingly enough, was out there in the sort of, big book kind of a place. I remember getting in a taxi once, and I was with my Canadian boyfriend at the time, and the taxi driver was doing the whole, oh, you're Canadian tourists, and I didn't say anything. And he goes, I had a great fella in my cab the other day. He was a writer. He said he was writing a book. And I said, what are you writing the book about? And he said, it's just going to be a really big book about Dublin. And his name was James Joyce. Have you ever heard of him? And this guy was just wandering. And the idea wasn't, I think, for us to understand that somehow he had James Joyce in his cab, but it's just the way Dubliners talk, so it was really funny. So Joyce, and the book, I dipped in and out of it at various stages of my life, but never been able to sort of, get through it page by page like any normal book. And for all sorts of reasons, I mean, time and the book itself, and I always have 15 books by my bed that I'm reading. So when lockdown happened, like within a week of it, the very first lockdown, within a week, I was like, okay, this is going to be the perfect opportunity. I'm going to finally read War and Peace and Ulysses and all those books, And in my head, I was like, it's not going to last a week. We're in it for the long haul, right? Mm-hmm. So I was scrolling through Facebook and something popped up and it said something about, joining a Zoom to hear Ulysses. And I thought, perfect. I wrote to them and got the Zoom link, and I thought, this is great. But I thought I was kind of going to be just listening in and somebody would be reading it, and maybe there'd be Q&A or something. So I jumped on, and I didn't even have my copy of the book because some of my books are in storage. And as they started talking, I realized, oh crap, this is a round robin reading. And I don't even have the book in front of me. And it didn't cross my mind to just say, oh, I'll just listen for today. I had to scramble and find a PDF of the book and find the place. And they were all talking about the chapters. They're like, well, we're right at the beginning. We're on whatever the first one's called. I forget. And I was like, well, on the PDF, the chapter names aren't written. Of course, all the stuff I learned afterwards, right? Mm-hmm. And so I jumped in and read with them, and it was great fun and everything. And I thought, oh, this is brilliant. So then I started doing it regularly. And then we had Ulysses, they would read it on Thursdays, and then they started reading Finnegans Wake on Tuesdays, and we were reading Dubliners on Saturday, and The Portrait on another day. And it was loads of fun. I was with my daughter, who was 12 at the time. She just started Sec 1, and of course was doing school from home and struggling with it and struggling with math. And I was like, oh, screw the homework. Come on and read Joyce with me. And she was having a brilliant time, and they loved her, and there were all these it was this mishmash of academics and curious people and a bunch of I'm Irish Americans, and all sorts of people from all over the world. And of course, we were understanding as we went how many languages are in the book, because suddenly someone would say, oh, that's actually written in Turkish, and we'd like, oh, it's not gobbledygook, it's Turkish, and so it was really, really fun. And it started to become a bit like church, like it was, and, I'm not a churchgoer, but it felt like it was this sort of thing that we could not miss. It was punctuating our days in the middle of the lockdown chaos. And so this is a long preamble. I tend to be long-winded, but I will get
perfect
there. So it was coming up to Bloomsday. And I had a tradition here in Montreal that I would often on Bloomsday have people over for Burgundy and Gorgonzola, and I'd put the book on the table and we'd sit around and eat kidneys and Gorgonzola and, So it was sort of a thing I used to do in the past, and I hadn't done it in a few years, but Bloomsday was coming up and somebody in the group proposed, why don't we do an online reading? And it just became a monster. And I had a lot of experience of doing online stuff, teaching online and stuff already. So I was really familiar with the interface. And so we set up this thing where people would get tickets free, obviously, but through, set up a whole thing where we were going to read the entire book beginning to end over 36 hours. Whoa. And so we had to set up rosters of people in the different time zones. And we had I think about 300 people all over the world. And for 36 hours, we read the book beginning to end. So it was a huge project and really fun. And it was something to do because it was COVID and my work had suddenly dried up and the world had just gone. So it was, became a really fun project. And one of the individuals, I'm getting to the point now, one of the guys who's actually from Sweny's and was a member of the board mentioned in one of the readings he came on, and we could see his background had changed. And he's, I'm between apartments, so I'm staying with a friend. Mm-hmm. And it happened to be his birthday. So there were going to be people coming over. It was coming up to Bloomsday. So he was staying in this friend's house. And I remember looking at the house going, oh, I love that place. It looks like a place I'd want to live. It was just whatever way it was set up and the artwork. Mm-hmm. And so on Bloomsday, he checked in first. He did some readings from the house before he went to Sweeney's because things had, I can't remember if they'd opened up or they were just going there anyway. And his housemate, the friend he was staying with, came on to do the reading. Mm-hmm. And I don't remember much about the physicality of the guy. He was wearing some kind of big smock or Victorian nightgown or something. But I was really struck by his voice as he was reading. It really, really struck me. And then, but it was in the middle of a day of, like I said, just in, I think I probably read overall about 8 hours of the day at different points. Wow. But not me on my own, in mm-hmm. groups for an hour at a time. But I kept thinking about this voice I'd heard, but it all got mixed up in all the voices and the whole experience, and it was wonderful. But then afterwards, I couldn't get this person's voice out of my head, how they'd read the book and the sensibility. And I don't even remember the passage. And I think it was when they were having the argument with the citizen, when Bloom's having the argument mm-hmm. with the citizen. I think that was it. Because I remember hearing things. And I work with this theater group in France, and I've been training a lot in listening to voices and so on. So I really was struck. And I spent a whole summer, I found the guy's profile on Facebook, and, what was public was mostly just very generic stuff, reposts and things like that. But I was curious and I kept doing it. And I'm not the person who connects with people on social media if I don't know them. My rule has always been, I'll accept your Facebook request if you've had tea in my house. Otherwise, no, you don't have to be a best friend, but I have to know you as a person. And that's partly for professional reasons too, right? But I was really compelled. And for a couple of months, I was kind of stalking this guy, but there were no pictures of him or anything. And so eventually I sent a friend request. And that one thing led to another. And we started chatting, and then we started videoing. And then it was about a year after, and there was a big Joyce thing. And he used to go to Sweeney's to the readings in person for years. And he was a Hawaiian guy who was living in Dublin. And, because I grew up in Ireland. And anyway, so we talked for months and months. And then in January, and went off for an 8-day first date with him and came back engaged.
What? Oh my gosh.
So, and I'm 50 years old. I don't do stupid stuff like this. Right? So I didn't even tell my parents I was going to Ireland. We had to arrange the entire thing in secret. And then we just told people by showing up for the reading side by side, in his kitchen. And everyone was like, what the hell? And at that point, we've been talking for months. I was totally smitten, So it was really all, let's just check if it's real in person and not some weird internet affair, because I know nothing. I've never done online dating or anything like that. Yeah. So that's the story. And then one thing's led to another and blah, blah, blah. And we're both very close friends with PJ at Sweeney's, who I'm sure you're going to be chatting to if you haven't already. So that's the story. I was just talking to him, and he's like, you should have her interview us together, because he's a big intellect and Joyce scholar and everything. Wow. So there you go.
Oh my gosh, that's fantastic. What a fun story.
It's so everything is tied up in Joyce and Molly's yes. And I mean, we planned our wedding was planned for Bloomsday last year. We ended up having to cancel it because of travel, COVID related stuff. But
oh my gosh,
it's all Bloom and Bloom and Bloom and Molly and Bloom and Molly's yes. And even the poetry he's written me and I've written him. I mean, it's hilarious. And they all love it at Sweeney's, of course, because after I left, he was really drunk one night and he sent a message. He thought he was sending a direct message to me, but he sent it to the whole reading group. And I kind of wrote into it and said, like, dude, you know, this is the public group. This is the group chat. And he was like, oh, it doesn't matter. Everybody, she said, yes, it's Molly's yes. And so they all got on board with it. So they're all really excited about it. I thought Ilaria might have told you the story, actually.
No, she didn't. Oh my gosh. I'm sure she was saving it for you guys to tell. That's amazing. What on earth?
So there you go. You want a bonkers James Joyce related story? It's hilarious. And it just so happens that this guy looks like the spitting image of Oscar Wilde. So it's...
No. Oh my gosh. You have hit the jackpot. Who doesn't want that?
I know, right?
Oh, wow.
So there you go.
Oh my goodness.
A huge arc to the story, and it's still writing itself. And it is as chaotic and as hilariously entertaining as reading the book, because it is that, like, all the places in the book are places that are part of our life together and just everything. And just there were so many fun things going on. And he is someone, because he'd been living in Ireland for 20 years. PJ was a very good friend of his, and he was friends with PJ where PJ used to just go to pubs long before PJ had bought Sweeney's. And PJ would just sit in pubs and read the book, and Tad would sit there and read with him. So he's sort of part of this whole scene from the beginning, and used to go into Sweeney's all the time and because they did the readings in person there. And the odd thing being that I had never, in all the years I lived in Ireland, I never sought out Sweeney's. And it's in this weird little place, so that even when I did start, I was like, oh, it's near Trinity, I should find it. But it wasn't a cultural center. For years, it was still just run as a pharmacy, right?
Gotcha.
But I always wanted to find the spot, and I just never managed to find it. So the first time I actually went there, and I remember the last time I was in Dublin before the pandemic, going to the new Museum of Literature. I don't know if you've heard about it. There's a new Museum of Literature in Dublin near Stephen's Green. And they had opened up with this huge Joyce exhibit. So I went to that, and I was going to meet my parents and my daughter to go to the National Concert Hall afterwards. And I realized I could walk to the concert hall by where Sweeney's was supposed to be. The Sweeney's I could never find. And even that night I didn't find it. And I since learned I walked right by it, basically, but must have been closed or something. So the first time I ever actually walked into Sweeney's was with this guy, my boyfriend. And at the time it was still, they didn't know if it was real or not. So, we walked in together, and PJ was like, there you are. And we had the champagne, and I've made videos about it. And he was singing, songs that are in the book. Another thing we did as a group of readers during it all was, the way that people were doing a lot of those virtual choirs during lockdown. We did one where we sang the song that Molly's always talking about.
Love's Old Sweet Song?
Love's Old Sweet Song. So we have that. I should send it to you, the link to it. There were 16 of us sang it in our little bedrooms and offices and put it together.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, and it became this incredible, actually, I'm going to read to you something that came up as a Facebook memory this morning. And I said, oh my God, I've got to read this to her.
For sure.
And it was something that Jack Walsh, who's one of the Sweeney's guys, said at the beginning of a reading this day last year. So we'd been doing it for a year. Wow. And he said, Sweeney's is a physical place that gave birth to a spiritual place. And that was in response to one of the readers who's in Texas ended the reading, and he said, I wrote down everything he said. He said, I want to say one thing. Money's taking over the world and it's relentless. But what we're building here, what Sweeney's is building here, is key. If you can bring people into appreciating the literature and the art and get their hearts into it, that's a real memorial. The rest of it's nice, the discussions and stuff, I like it. But it's really the spirit of engaging with the art. I think Joyce was wonderfully smart in choosing writing, because writing needs nothing. You just need paper and a pen. Anyway, I have tons of stuff like that, because it became this little sanctuary. Like, nobody talked about the pandemic and nobody talked about Trump. And we just didn't. So we talked about everything else, and it's full of politics and full of all that stuff, right? And there were loads of times where we'd all be sitting there and they're talking about vaccinations and we'd all be like, you know.
Oh, loud.
But it was sort of like an unspoken rule. And so we all became friends and we'd check in on it, you know, but it was just, we would come in to read. We didn't, like, we'd jibber jabber a bit and, you know, and it was live streaming and we'd talk about and tell personal stories, but it was somehow always kept in the abstract a little bit. And it was just this lovely place. And all these crazy things happened. Like, one of the guys, after about 6 months of reading with this group, there was one day one guy mentioned that he was in Cleveland. And we knew he was American, but we hadn't even asked where each other was. And I said something like, oh, you know, I have an uncle in Cleveland. Of course, turned out they were 20-year drinking buddies. My uncle was this guy's best friend. And I was like, oh my God. So it's much more than a book. Much more than a book.
Well, what is it? If you had to say, like, I mean, all of these things have happened to you, like through the Sweny's reading group, especially, but all this stuff, like, what is Ulysses then? Or who is James Joyce that all of this is wrapped up in it? Like,
it's so interesting. I mean, he is a character. And when people talk about who he was, like, I bought Nora recently, right?
Okay,
when actually on one of the trips home to Tad. And so I was reading Nora, and, you know, what I love about reading Nora is that it's so clever. There's so many hat tips to the book in there. And obviously it's a fictionalized version of their affair, but very, you know, very obviously, consciously, deliberately, and in your face from this perspective of, you know, the Galway girl who claimed not to be an intellect and blah, blah, blah. And I realized so much of her rolling the eyes sort of what felt similar to my own experience on first reading it. So when I first jumped in with these guys and we were reading the book, and then the big intellectual discussion might be, and the discussion could go any direction, but sometimes there'd be people who jump in with a big theory and this, that, and the other. And I wasn't quite there yet. And my instinct was always that sort of roll of the eyes thing as well, because what I enjoyed and the reason I stayed was when we started, I think they'd already, like, I jumped in, it was actually the very second online reading. So they, you know, Buck Mulligan had already come out, you know, stately plump Buck Mulligan and all that. I mean, I've read the book about 6 times now in the last couple of years. You know?
Oh my gosh.
Gone from 0 to 100. But what I enjoyed when I jumped in, and especially with my daughter, was, I mean, first of all, there was like, hey, this is something about your Irishness. And she's identifies more as Irish than I do. You know, I have a lot of issues with nationalism and citizenship and all that, but she was, you know, she's like, I'm Irish, blah, blah, blah. And she loved it. And she would often, sometimes people would be discussing some sort of little naggly knot and trying to find these intellectual reasons and, you know, making connections with philosophy and history and blah, 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 and politics. And she'd say, oh, it's just this, you know, with that sort of openness of a 14-year-old. And they'd all go, oh, you're right. She'd say, oh, my grandmother says that all the time. It just means this. And they'd be like, oh, and I'd be like, you're right. You know, because sometimes those funny turns of phrase are just a direct translation from Irish. And it's not James Joyce being brilliant, although he's always being brilliant. I mean, clearly, I love the party in his head. And I spend so much time at that party in his head we're all invited to, right? But for me, more than anything, it was the music. And that was why I love Finnegans Wake. I would read it like I read beat poetry, you know, where you just go with the beat. And it reminded me so much of the beats. And, you know, you'd be reading and enjoying it. And then what's the name of the chapter where it's like, where it's all music, where they're watching the parade outside and they're in a bar?
Is it Sirens?
Yes.
Okay, I was going to say
Sirens, yeah. Like, I remember when we landed on Sirens for the first time and the music of it and the rhythm and being able to hear the different you know, that it was written symphonically. So the different voices were coming in almost like different instruments or threads of music. And it was just wild, you know, and how every chapter is like that, right? You never know what's going to come next when you're reading it for the first time. And so reading it all just for the sheer pleasure of the music in it, which comes from, you know, the poetry background. My mother always read poetry to us, and we're a big poetry family. So being able to just experience it all. And I read it all as poetry. I realize that now. I was experiencing the book as just a beautiful long poem, like a beat poem that kept shifting tempo and shifting pace and shifting form. And that just, it was the music of it and the color. And it was almost a synaesthetic experience, because there'd be moments where it was color, like, you know, flashes of memory. And I was in a place that was being described, you know, that was only recognizing for the first time, you know, saying, oh, and, you know, becoming fascinated by characters like Mackintosh, because when Mackintosh, we had one day, again, Mackintosh had appeared and somebody said, well, who was Mackintosh? And again, in my lovely innocence, had no idea that this has been a big question of scholars for the last 8 gajillion years or 100. And so I was like, okay, you know, and I was goofing around and I was just like, okay, everybody, homework for next week. I want all of you to write a sonnet. It can be Alexandrian or, you know, Shakespearean, answering the question, who's Mackintosh, right?
Wow.
And, you know, and I was just goofing around and everyone went, yes, teacher, you know, and they all went off. But then a couple of people emailed me and said, I've got my sonnet. Do you want us to read them in the reading or should we send them to you? And I'm like, oh my God, they did it. So then I thought, I better write a sonnet, right? So I banged out a sonnet really quickly with my answer. And then we got on the reading and I said, okay, has everyone got their sonnets, you know, and people were shy. So I read mine and they loved it. And then because we were live streaming, a few people contacted me afterwards and said, oh, what are you doing with these sonnets? There was one guy who's a prof in the States somewhere who said, I'm going to give it to my students as I think it's a great exercise. Write a sonnet answering the question. So I started collecting all these sonnets. And then some people wrote haikus and some people wrote limericks. And my plan was to put them all together in a book. So I started getting little bios from people and photographs, you know, about why they wrote the sonnet this way or what it meant to them, to make a little one-off print of a book, you know, using one of those online things. Yeah. And the plan was to bring it to Sweeny's and just leave it there. And then I can't remember what happened, but that project fell by the wayside because I'm always starting new projects. But it came up again recently and I have them all these beautiful sonnets from people answering the question, who's Mackintosh? So you see, the book just kept generating new, and what it did, to answer your question, it opened up, it finally allowed me I finally found permission for myself in it, along with Tad and along with all these people, to embrace my own creative or artistic side. So as someone who loves art and loves poetry and loves all this stuff, but with zero talent, self-professed, you know, I have no talent. So, and I work in leadership development. So, you know, I'm an executive coach. I do a lot of leadership development stuff. And, you know, and before that, I was working in the belly of the corporate monster, places like McKinsey and management consulting firms and banks and things. And it was sort of easier to wear that costume than to try to wear the artist costume and feel like an imposter. So I always did, but over the years, of course, the leadership development has brought me back to the theater, and I do more and more of that. So this whole Ulysses experience, especially in lockdown, where my world was reduced to this, and then being opened up by these people around the world who are also experiencing a similar shutdown of the world. And as somebody said, choosing very specifically to connect on a really specific place, like just about this book that's full of possibility. But like I said, we didn't know who each other was or where we lived or if people had husbands or wives or jobs or any of that. You know, it was just this. And it opened up so much. It was as if it gave everybody permission to explore that side of themselves. And that became really, really exciting. And we became so knowledgeable. And there came to be this spiritual element of it. And some of the group, we kind of broke off. There was a little Barney at Sweeny's and we broke off, and because they wanted to do always Irish writers. And so we would, you know, we did a lot of Wilde. On Saturdays, it was kind of, because we started with the portrait, then we did Dubliners, then we read The Importance of Being Earnest, and then we did the troubles. So we were reading Irish books. And then somebody said, let's do Dante. Let's do the Divine Comedy. Let's do the whole thing, the Divine Comedy. But they were like, oh, it's not an Irish writer and blah, blah, blah. But there were a bunch of Italians in it. So we said, okay, let's set up another group. So we've been reading the Divine Comedy now for a year in Italian and everything. And of course, there's so many overlaps. And the fun thing is, a lot of the discussions end up flipping into, you know, as Dante was ascending to heaven, we were like finding parallels with Bloom and Daedalus, and Beatrice became Nora and Molly and all this stuff. And, you know, and the whole fantasy thing about what's real and what's not real, and how Finnegans Wake was Molly's dream, and, you know, stream of consciousness, and it all just, so it's constantly getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then life keeps imitating art, keeps imitating life, keeps imitating art. And we brought in, like, we're always laughing because it's, you never know if you're going to end up talking about Buddhism or Hindu practices, or suddenly we're talking about recipes and how people eat, and, you know, potted meat. And maybe it just was Plumtree's potted meat. Maybe it wasn't a metaphor for anything else, you know. And I can't believe that you and I were in the same podcast together.
Yeah. What are the chances?
Just remember that.
What are the chances?
I was like, oh my God, I forgot to tell Tad that.
And you know what's funny too is, like, the group that I was with who did the little, like, we had the same thing where literally the pandemic like started and the world shut down, and I was like, we need a Ulysses reading group. So it's so interesting. So like amazing. That was a group that did that podcast. And it's so I feel like we had like a very similar experience too. Actually, I've interviewed a couple of like my friends who were in that group. And it, like, we seem to have had like a lot of similar experiences. Like, one of my friends talked about how, like, it was so nice because like the world was confusing and we didn't understand anything. And it was so nice to come to Ulysses and be able to be confused and not understand about something else that wasn't the pandemic.
Yes.
Like,
exactly.
We still didn't know what was going on, but it's okay in that context.
It was. I think you're right. I hadn't even thought of it like that, but it was permission to be confused about a specific thing. So we didn't have to think about the big existential question of our lives. We were like, oh, let's just riddle me this.
Interesting that like you've compared like your Ulysses like reading group to like church and attending that. And Ilaria and I talked a bit about like Catholicism and like what it means to like be Catholic while reading Joyce, who has this like very like ambivalent relationship with Catholicism.
It's interesting because I remember saying to people, this is like mass, and I didn't use the word church because that's a very Protestant way of saying it in Ireland. Protestants say I'm going to church, but Catholics say going to mass, right?
Okay, good to know.
And so it was interesting. I remember saying to them, this is like mass, but you know, again, and what's interesting listening to you say that, because I do remember when I think my first introduction to Joyce, the first book I read was The Portrait, right? Mm-hmm. And I didn't read it till I think I may even have been in first year in college, right? Wow. Now, I probably read, I'm sure we had Dubliners at home. I'd probably read some of the stories because when I read The Dead again recently, it felt like some ancestral memory was waking up, you know, so
wow.
It was definitely back there in my consciousness. But the one I remember reading first was The Portrait at the beginning of college in Ireland. And when I was reading it, feeling like, oh my God, this is me. Stephen Dedalus is me. Like all his battles, which, you know, they're universal at that age. Mm-hmm. And then specifically the Irish thing, you know, the sow who eats her farrow and she's going to suck you and you can never be anything unless you get out of Ireland. Like that was everything that drove me. And I was like, getting out. Wow. And I had decided on France because I was good at French. It was one of my good subjects in school. And I thought that's an easy way out. I know the language. I love big Francophile. I'm like, I'm just going to go there. So when I read The Portrait, I'm like, yes, he understands me. He understands me. And so that's where I went with it. Now, interestingly enough, it's kind of like reading Catcher in the Rye. As you get older, every time you reread it, you have a different impression of Stephen Dedalus. Yeah. And I went through like thinking he was an obnoxious little shit full of his own importance. And, you know, now I've come around to loving him again, right back the way I did at the beginning. But it took some time and I had to do an awful lot of growing up of my own, you know. Mm-hmm. But there is something about that. And what I realized, and especially in the discussions, because some of the Italian, like Ilaria lived in Dublin for a while, and Massey also, he lives in Dublin now, and he's another Italian. He's the guy who runs the Dante readings. One of the things I realized as we're reading it, some of the stuff from having grown up in Ireland, and my mother's side of the family was Dublin. I mean, and all the places and all the people and the way they speak and the way they do things was so familiar to me that it felt second nature and didn't feel it needed explaining. So sometimes even the Italians who'd lived there for so long, because when you've grown up in it, first of all, you recognize things that are Irish vernacular or directly translated from the Irish, or what Joyce does. There are lots of things that we say in English that are direct translations from the Irish. But there are lots of times where he does it, where it's not part of common vernacular, but he just does it anyway. And you're like, oh, clever you, I saw what you did there, you know.
Wow.
But of course, someone who doesn't speak Irish wouldn't know that. Mm-hmm. And then little references, or even the way the music happens, or the way he refers to things. So things like when you say Mass and Catholicism and confession, the way he talks about it is so familiar, it kind of washed over me the first time until I realized, oh, this is not the experience of Catholicism for a currently practicing Italian Catholic like Ilaria, but also very different to then those people who were Irish Americans who knew a lot and had gone back to Ireland over the years as kids and adults, but didn't actually grow up immersed in it. So didn't have parents who didn't even consider you not going to communion or confession. Which is the story in Dubliners where it's the old guy who basically nothing happens, but he's thinking of this woman he wants to court.
Is it like a painful case, the one where she
yes.
suicide at the end? Okay.
Yeah. So I remember reading that and thinking, I know this person. I've met this person 1,000 times, you know? And there is something about, obviously, the universality of it. I mean, as a very clever man who is clearly a very, you know, not only well-read and very consciously going to be well-read and well-educated and had that sort of, I don't know, he had that bone to pick with the world, obviously, around his own brilliance and intellectualism and everything else, but also someone who had a really intuitive sense of human psychology, you know, almost despite himself, despite his conscious approach to it. I think there was also very intuitive curiosity that was driving stuff. And so that it creates that universality of experience in something that's so specific. Like one guy took a walk one day, you know. A guy goes for a walk, the end. That's what Ulysses is, right? A guy goes for a walk. But in every single thing, even if it's just him taking a dump, you know, all that at the beginning, and everyone's like, I get it. Or, you know, and sort of Molly and, you know, the whole notion of the love that dare not speak its name. It's not just about, you know, Oscar Wilde and gay sex. It's also just because in Ireland, even when I was growing up in the 80s, you just didn't talk about that stuff, even to your best friends, you know, like we were quite prudish. And, you know, the very notion of having a fantasy, you'd have to sort of second guess yourself, you know, so all the sex in it is so out there in ways like, it's like he turned everything inside out, but made it normal. It's like everyone's wearing their clothes with the labels on the outside, you know?
Oh, wow.
So I don't know, there's so much of it that just feels like, oh yeah. And as you read it, like nothing shocks, at least for me, nothing was shocking. But then I thought, out of this little sanctuary, of course I can see why it was shocking at the time and everyone was freaking out. And there were so many things you don't know. Like there's one page you go on and where they're saying the word yes. And maybe, is that Ulysses or Finnegans Wake?
Wow. I mean, I feel like that's an impressive issue to have, though. Not many people can say that.
It's so, and so tell me, so you're doing what? Tell me about your master's. So
Ulysses is always at the center of it for me. I think if only because I trust it to have like everything in it. So whatever I want to write about, I'm like, I'm sure I can fit Ulysses.
Yes.
But yeah, I don't know, especially with like the ideas more and more of like wanting to talk about like Catholicism and like the like Catholic understanding of like forgiveness and confession and that sort of thing. I'm like, oh, obviously I have to bring portrait in, and I'm trying to actually have it beside me. I'm like that far into Finnegans Wake. I'm close for the first time, but I don't know. So like And, you know, I can see.
And you know, the whole point is, of course, once you get to the end, you got to go back to the beginning to finish the sentence.
And then you won't be able to stop, and it just keeps going. But, and, you know, so I thought I was just kind of, it's like the professor that I'm kind of like angling to have as my supervisor kept like assuming that I'd read Finnegans Wake. So I was like I said I never would, but I'm going to have to. But like, so I thought I was just kind of like reading it to be able to say that I'd read it because, oh, you're like a Joyce scholar, you need to have read Finnegans Wake and whatever, we'll just get it over with. But now as I'm reading it, I'm like, oh no, like I realized the same thing. I'm like, there's not meaning in the same way as in Ulysses or Portrait or anything like this, but I'm beginning to see like what it's doing, and I'm beginning to see, you know, like every time he uses the word confess or whatever, I underline it and I'm like, oh, I'm gonna have to come back to that. So I think, yeah, that's my like biggest takeaway from my master's so far. Is like all of a sudden there's no way to work with just Ulysses, like it has to be Joyce.
Yeah, and that really kind of threw me over backwards because again I was experiencing Finnegans Wake as something different.
Yeah.
And then it like threw me over because I had no idea when we got to the end and realized like to finish the sentence on the last page, you've got to go back to the beginning. And I was like, oh, that's what they were talking about. And then as we were reading that, like there are 72 languages. So Finnegans Wake definitely must be read aloud. Because sometimes when you're reading the gobbledygook, even in your head, it's like, what? And then when you read it aloud, it's like, oh, I'm just speaking English. It's just English. It's just spelled differently. Or like it is in Finnegans Wake where there's that one page and he's saying yes, but it's yes, and there's something we counted 34 languages because there were so many internationals. And it's just the word yes, but you don't realize it because it's strung together as if they were made up words. So it doesn't look like you're saying we, see, yes, you know, and the way the words are strung together. But like I said, there was a Turkish guy in the reading and he said, oh, that's yes. And then someone said, and that's yes in Arabic. And we started pulling, and we realized one of those long sentences is just the word yes in 30 languages.
Gosh.
And you're like, God damn it, the guy is a genius, you know? And then you're like, and then the other day when Bill, the guy in Cleveland, who's my uncle's best buddy, said he was giving a talk for the centenary. And as he was giving the talk, he had a realization. And then afterwards, I told Tad about it. And Tad said, oh, yeah, people have been saying that for years. But he had just had the realization. It made sense to me. Because he was saying, you know, when you're reading Molly's Yes, he said women have that temptation to make it into the orgasm, right? And we all do. And it's like, yes. And we get all hot and bothered and we read our yeses and da-da-da and have fun with it. And I think even though we know it's not, because she's just kicked blazes boiling out, right?
Yes.
And she's falling asleep and she's counting sheep. And we know she's passing out. And that's where the stream of consciousness happens. You know, she's going through lists like you do. So again, in that was clever Joyce. He gives us the option to express that orgasmic yes that was so not allowed in Ireland in any way, shape, or form. But we actually know it's not what's going on in that moment, right? It's not the orgasm like, yes, you know, it's just her dropping off to sleep going, yes. And then immediately, if you pick up Finnegans Wake, then that's the dream state. It's a perfect continuation from stream of consciousness falling asleep into Molly's dream. And it's such a feminine book, the whole circular thing. And the fact that like, when you think of her stream of consciousness, she goes back, you know, she's going back into childhood and into the present, but she's listing all the people and all the lovers and Moldy and Stanhope and all that. And you realize, oh my God. And then that's exactly what Anne Olivia Plurabelle is doing in Finnegans Wake. It's going back and back. And then you come around to the beginning and start again and River Run. And, you know, she goes from the seed cake on a Howth Head and lying down with Bloom. And then they're right into, of course, it's like, you know, River Run and Howth Head and everything. So, of course it is. Finnegans Wake is just the continuation into her dream. So when you get to Finnegans Wake, you can do that a few times because you know the way when you have a dream that you remember. Sometimes you think it's a dream you've had many times and a repeating dream. And the more you think about the dream, the more it becomes a memory. And then it becomes your repeating dream, even though you may have only had it once. And I think that's what happens. That's why, so you can drop off from Molly falling asleep, read Finnegans Wake, read it again, and then swing back into waking up again with Bloom right at the beginning of the day.
Oh my gosh.
And it's like, oh my God, that's so damn clever. And people are always falling asleep, like at the end of The Dead.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in that beautiful moment where she's just thinking about that young guy who died. It's nothing to do with him. But he's getting all jealous of this dead young lover he can't compete with because he's dead, and it's beautiful. And she's not even thinking about him. She's just having a moment because she's falling asleep, you know? And there's so much of that. Just allow yourself to fall asleep, allow yourself to get into your unconscious. You know what I mean? It's always that, just allow it. And I think that's one of the really clever things of Joyce, as understanding, well, what he says, a woman's body, a woman's consciousness, like, and I don't want to reduce it in a binary way to women, but understanding that the female anima or whatever, that sort of having such an openness and a courage given his times to embrace that female side of himself and allow the whole female arc of storytelling and language and expression to emerge in the book. And so in all the books, they're specific to the female characters, but we know in him it was an understanding that we've all got it within us. We all have all the archetypes within, you know, and that sort of Jungian thing. And then you get into Jung, and that's a whole other thing. But, you know, it's like you could. I said to someone recently, I might never read any other book again. Like, I could just keep reading this one. You know?
Honestly, wouldn't be so bad. It seems to happen anyway. If it's taking up this much of our time, might as well just commit to it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you know, I mean, it's the fun thing about it. I mean, I remember the first lover I ever read it with saying, like, he was a scholar who'd studied English at Columbia. And I was doing my master's in French at McGill at the time. So he was all like, oh, blah, 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 the Irish method, whatever, as opposed to the American teaching method. And we were chatting. And then one day he was like, you know, we should make it our bath reading book. So whenever we took a bath, we'd pick up Ulysses and just open it at a random page. And then, of course, you know, an hour and a half later, we'd have shriveled skin and not even touch the wine glasses. And, you know, and sort of just reading the book evoked him again. It's like, there is that lovely thing too, that it evokes, you know, sort of, well, what we're always talking about, the specific and the universal, like experiences of love or regret or betrayal or fear or disappointment. I mean, there's only a dozen stories under the sun, and they're universal, but our own experience of it is so unique to us. And so that I can be reading a line and it feels so specifically written for my experience of, you know, a past lover or something like that. And somebody else in the room is having an entirely different one. And we know it. And I'm never going to say, this reminds me of my ex-boyfriend. But in that moment, there's something that's so uniquely specific to the individual in the whole universal. And yet it's written as such a universal, an individual book. It's like we said, a guy went for a walk, you know, 80 gajillion pages later, his wife fell asleep, you know.
What a story.
Yeah, right.
Of course it's lasted for 100 years.
Right? I mean, it's insane. They did the Sweeney's reading group. The pharmacy's been around for a while, and they would do readings in person, and people would drop in, and some people went regularly. And they call it a cultural center. It's run as a nonprofit, but it's a tiny room. And you really can't do much. You know, there's a counter, a big wooden counter that takes it up. So you walk in the door, there's standing room technically for maybe 3 or 4 people. Oh. Now they've managed to cram in 60 at a time. There's always booze. PJ is the lifeblood of the place, because when they started the online readings, none of them are techies, right? So they have their board, and one of them's an actor, and one of them's a lawyer, and, you know, one of them's a neuroscientist. They had this shared love of Ulysses, and they were helping him run it as a nonprofit. And they came on, and they would basically read the readings. But PJ was this beautiful character. He's gorgeous looking. He's an incredible soul. Read the book 70 times, beloved by so many people. He is one of those people who has a capacity to touch people's life with such grace and beauty that you're not even aware of it at the time. Like, you know, that person who makes everyone feel so special. And it's really interesting because he's definitely Irish, like not, and sort of seems to have a foot in the two camps, like the Irish and the Anglo-Irish. And by Anglo-Irish, you know, the Protestant ascendancy, who lived in the big houses. Like, PJ's a little bit posh, but he's also a little bit tinker, you know. And like, he went, and he's obviously very well educated and knowledgeable, but there's no pretense. He doesn't seek to teach. Everything is conversational. But you know, the number of people he has taken under his wing, he's got so many people like that, you know, and he is this incredible human being. And so you walk in and like he'll break into song at any time, you know, pull out the guitar and start singing a song, and you feel he's singing it for you. And so we jump on the Zooms and he'll say something like, you know, he'd say, oh, Shelby, that's a fabulous shirt. Look at you. You're always so well put together. And he'll say something, but, you know, as he gets to know you, he'll find something in it that, you know, that beautiful kindness of somebody who will remember something you once said and always refer to it. So it makes a really between us, I see you kind of link, you know?
Oh my gosh.
Like he's magical. And when you meet him, you'll see that. And suddenly everybody's volunteering and doing work for free with him because he's that kind of guy, you know?
Oh, I love that.
And he doesn't try. And he's just like an extraordinary human being. I mean, I can send you videos I have of him, you know, when we went in with like the day because when Tad and I got engaged, he wanted to give me his grandmother's ring as an engagement ring. And so there was this whole long story of getting it from his mother who was in the States and blah, blah, blah. And the ring went missing in customs and all this crazy stuff. And when it finally showed up in Dublin, and I was there at the time, we had to get it resized. So we went to this place again that could easily have been a place in the book because it's, you know, just, it's the place you go for engagement rings in Dublin. Like it was, you know, there was one for Northsiders and one for Southside, and they were the two well-known jewelers that have been around forever. So we had to go there to get it resized. And when we picked up the ring, when I was first wearing it, we went straight to Sweeney's to show it to PJ first, you know, and we went in with the champagne and he sang us songs. And with this crazy thing happened when he popped the champagne, he was talking and the cork went up in the air and landed in my glass and the glass shattered. It was so weird. You know? We were like, it's a sign, you know, because of course that's the thing when you get wrapped up in what's life and what's art. And we were also wrapped up in the book and everyone's always drunk all the time on top of that. Like we had no idea when was real and when it wasn't. Everything just became this theatrical performance, but not performance in a manipulative way or performance in a sort of an artificial way, but a sort of a sense that everyone had permission to perform, you know, as if my life is my stage, you know, like geisha, you know, making your life your art, like the whole Japanese concept of geisha. And that's happening constantly. And it's so much fun.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw, it was like a Zoom performance. I think it was by the James Joyce Center, but I can't remember now. But they did Ivy Day in the committee room, but it was like I think all or most of them were like played by women. Sort of this idea that like in Parnell's story, right? It's so much, we don't, no one says Kitty O'Shea's name. It's just like, oh, like we have some women, you know, in the story. And so I don't know, it was interesting for them to like actively put women into that room.
And I think in all of it, every single one of those characters has so much, and it's back to what I was saying about, you know, the female and the male and the archetypes. Mm-hmm. Any of the characters, were you to suddenly make all the men women and all the women men, it would also work.
Yes, for sure.
It was like, because what was the thing? Oh, the other thing about Finnegans Wake, and I'll leave you with this, no, it's not Finnegans Wake. It's the Nighttown episode when they're in the brothel. Cersei, yes. Forever, you know the way you're thinking, you know the way each chapter is different and you're trying to figure out what kind of theater is it or where are we going with this, or every episode, I shouldn't say chapter.
That's okay.
Another thing I realized was, oh my God, this one, it seems like fantasy and dreamlike, or, you know, people talk about it being trippy and shroomy and everything. And then someone said, it's pantomime. And we were like, oh my God, that's what it is. It's just pure pantomime. You know, you got floating teapots and people dancing on tables and flying around. And if you take it in the context, Joyce would have grown up going to the panto every Christmas. That's what it is. It's just pantomime.
Isn't it?
And it completely changed it. Yeah.
Wow. That's one of those things, once you know it, you're like, obviously, how did
I can't unknow it.